Hi, I'm Courtney. This is Something Positive for Positive People, and today I'm going to introduce my first guest. This is Luna, who is 27 years old. She's a Caucasian, cisgendered female who works in herbal medicine and lives in Vermont.
Good job.
Oh, I got it!
You
Yes!
got it.
Yeah, it took two takes to get that done. So we actually did an episode before, the day after Halloween. I was hungover, I was kind of sick, and I was still wearing my Halloween costume. And the sound quality was bad. I moved around a lot, I did a lot of sniffling, and I had to go away from the mic to cough, but you could still hear it in the background. So luckily, Luna was able to make time for us to do a redo. Thank you.
You're very welcome. I'm always happy to talk with you.
Aw, appreciate that. So, Luna here is HSV1 and HSV2 positive, correct? All
Yeah, I'm a
right.
collector. Got both.
So how long well, you said you had HSV1 since you were a child, but you were recently diagnosed, by recently, I mean 2015, diagnosed with HSV2, is that correct?
I think it was 2014, actually.
Oh, 2014, you were diagnosed
I
with
think
HSV2.
so. It's kind of hard for me to remember. I know some people have this like herpiversary or whatever they want to call it, where they really remember the day they were diagnosed. I'm pretty sure it was 14.
Yeah.
I could be wrong.
And I'm the
It was
same
either
way.
14 or 15 for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So when you were diagnosed, how did that happen? Like, what made you go and get checked?
Well, I get tested at least once a year,
Hmm.
every year. Um, I have ever since I guess since I was sexually active, I was getting tested every year. And especially in college, because I wasn't identifying as polyamorous or non monogamous at that point, but I was like part of hookup culture in college. So I was definitely having sex with multiple people. And by the time I was getting tested in 2014, I was identifying as polyamorous or like I'm not monogamous. So I was dating multiple people and I went to get my regular screening. Now I tend to get tested like twice a year. Um, And that year, they called me after I got my test, and I was like, "How is everything?" She goes, "Oh, you know about the herpes, right?" And I was like, "Yeah, I have type 1." And she goes, "No, type 2." And that, I kind of for a second was like in shock. I was like, "What? How did that happen?" And I asked her about it, why I hadn't heard about it before. I was like, "But last year I was negative for that." She was like, "Oh, we didn't test you for herpes last year," which is the classic case of like when you ask to be tested for everything, they don't test you for everything. But I did have a negative HSV2 test at least in 2013 or 2012, depending on whatever year I got diagnosed.
Right.
2 years before that, I was negative. They missed a year. And so by the time I got diagnosed with it, I was like, shit, I could have had this for up to 2 years, basically. And everyone I've had sex with, I've been telling that I test negative for everything. So that could be, I could have been
Hmm.
lying.
Yeah.
So I was
And
kind of in shock.
that's kind of scary because you knew you had HSV1, and when she called, she said, "Oh, you know about the herpes." She didn't say you know about the HSV1, not the
Mm-hmm.
HSV2. So she made the assumption that it was the same, or she made the assumption that you knew that you had already had both types of herpes. So had you not been like, "Oh, HSV1," then you'd have gone on another at least 6 months not knowing, uh, possibly because the next person could have done the same thing. So that's
That's
crazy.
totally true.
That's,
Completely true. I never actually thought about it from that angle, but you're definitely right. If I had not asked that clarifying question, I would have been like, "Oh yeah, I already know," and I would have gone about my life just thinking I had HSV1 orally, like I always have since I was for as long as I can remember.
which from society's point of view is completely normal and fine and acceptable, because HSV1 orally is just cold sores. And
Mm-hmm.
in talking to people, like, there's a completely different, you're received a little bit differently if you have cold sores versus having herpes or HSV2, or if you have
Yeah.
HSV1 genitally. Like, people hear completely different things, like, oh, cold sores, everybody gets those. But then when you say, oh yeah, it's herpes or oral herpes or HSV1 orally, then it's like, what the fuck? Ew, gross. So that's,
You
I
know
don't know.
what's interesting about that though is that I always used to think that too. Like when I was only positive for HSV1, or even at least a year after I got diagnosed with HSV2 genitally, I kind of did treat HSV1 like, oh, it's no big deal, like up to, we don't have numbers, right? But it's like at least 65% of the population, if not 80 or 90% of the population has HSV1 orally.
It's very high, yeah. It's
And
more than half
so I
for
kind of
sure.
thought it was no big deal. But recently I've had, like, at least in my communities, I don't know what you've been hearing from doing the podcast, I'm just interacting with a lot more people who are much more freaked out by HSV1 orally than I've ever been. Because I've had it since I was a kid. So to me, it's not even an STI at that point. Like, I didn't get it sexually.
Right.
I probably got it from like a kiss from my mom, or like sharing a cup with my mom or something like that. It wasn't sexual. It was just like regular being a kid and sharing germs with people. But now that I'm older, and I'm like, I guess because of the communities I'm in, I've been having a lot of STI conversations in some of my communities, and people are really freaked out by HSV1 even orally. And I'm not sure if that's because more people are getting it generally, or if because the stigma is so strong that people are like, oh, herpes, like, I don't want it anywhere in my body, you know?
Have you talked to your mom about having herpes? Because I remember you
Yeah.
telling me before that your mom has it, and then you said that you had it, you got cold sores as a kid. So like I feel like the story behind that, if you're telling someone, let's say you're disclosing, you're saying, oh, I had cold sores as a kid. When you say it like that, it shifts the conversation. You shift that other person's perception to be more. It's like, oh, you didn't get an STD, you get cold sores that you got as a kid. But if you were to have gotten cold sores like now, then maybe they would have received it like, oh shit, you have herpes.
Maybe. That was kind of two questions. So I'll try to answer them in order. Like, I have talked to my mom about having herpes. HSV1, I do remember her mentioning growing up, saying things like, oh, I have a cold sore right now. And I have had cold sores when I was a kid too. Like, I don't think I've really gotten them as an adult. I can't remember the last time I had one. But I do remember having them as a kid. And if I would mention it to my mom, she'd be like, oh, that's just a cold sore. And we would go get, like, a Breva. Is that
Yeah.
that little thing they sell over the counter? So I knew she had it, but I just never thought anything of it. I was like, oh, whatever, cold sores.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't know that it was herpes at that time. And then I did talk to my parents. I told my parents when I got diagnosed with herpes type 2. I'm not sure when, but at some point in time I did mention it. And there was no judgment from them. I don't think they really, at least if there was, they didn't let me know that they were judging me for that. So yeah, I don't think my mom has type 2. I'm pretty positive she just has type 1. Not that I've never asked her outright,
No.
but I'm pretty positive.
Okay. So having a conversation with your mom or your parents wasn't difficult at all.
I'm pretty sure I just lumped it in.
Yeah.
This is actually a good transition conversation to me having come out on Facebook about herpes, because I lumped it into when I told them that I was bisexual or pansexual and polyamorous. Or I think maybe those were split up a little bit. I think I told my mom about polyamory at some point, and she didn't take it very well. I don't think she liked that. She was like, why do you need to have a label for that? Like, it could just be a phase.
Yeah.
That kind of thing that parents say. But I'm pretty sure I lumped herpes in when I was like, hey, by the way, I'm queer, I'm attracted to multiple genders, and I have herpes. And so I kind of threw it all in at once. And I don't really know how my mom reacted. My dad was really cool about it. He, I think I actually told them by text because I was nervous about it. It was only a couple years ago that I finally told them. And for some reason, because I think the way I told my mom about polyamory, she didn't take it very well. So I was like, well, how is she going to take it when I like tell her these other things?
And this is before you. Is this before you came out on National Coming Out Day?
Yes.
Okay.
It probably was on National Coming Out Day. The thing is, National Coming Out Day is also my birthday.
No.
And so I'm always very aware of it. Like, I'm always just, it's kind of, in my field of vision very strongly. And so I think I actually did send them that text on National Coming Out Day because I felt inspired too. And I was just like, it's my birthday. Nobody can be,
Yeah.
no one can take it weird when it's my birthday. But that was at least a year before I did it on Facebook. If not 2 years. I can't remember.
So you got that. It's nice to have your birthday associated with something like so large, especially with it being National Coming Out Day. It's not just that to you. It's like, oh yeah, it's also my birthday. All these people are doing these cool things for my birthday, and you can just make it about you or by attaching your birthday to it. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and at the same time feel part of a community. I love seeing everybody's posts on National Coming Out Day, even if they're already out as gay or bisexual or whatever. I do want to clarify, by National Coming Out Day. That's October 11th, and it's specifically for the LGBTQ community.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen some people come out as other things, like come out as kinky or whatever. Straight people come out as kinky, and in general, my queer friends don't receive that very well.
Hold on. People come out as kinky?
Yeah,
That's a
they
weird
do.
thing. That's weird. Like,
Yeah. I mean,
wait,
I can
so,
understand wanting to be out as whatever, like, be yourself out in the world, because obviously you and I are both into that.
but
But
it's not for you. You know what I mean?
that's
Like,
exactly it.
yeah.
That's exactly it. It's not for them. It's totally fine for if somebody is queer, if they're gay, and they also want to tack on. Like, I kind of tacked my things on. I was like, hey, I'm attracted to multiple genders. Also, I'm not monogamous. Also, I have herpes. Like, I threw everything all out there at once because it was all kind of piling on top. And I was like, you know what? If I'm going to be out about this one thing, I'm just going to be out about everything.
Yeah.
But I think if you're part of a privileged group, if you're a white guy and you're straight and you're cis and you have this one little thing, if you were going to come out as like being kinky or as having HSV1 orally or something, I'd be like, come on, dude, don't take up that space. That's not for you.
But I mean, part of that is just everybody wanting to be included, and I think that it's a way for people to support and encourage it. Because I mean, how many people who really don't, how many people who are privileged to not have any STDs or not have to deal with problems, prejudice in society or anything like that, like how can they really support or be involved without taking the thing that they feel like is such a secret to them and being like, oh, I also like feet, you know? I'm coming
Right?
out about liking feet.
I kind of think there's a time and a place to do it. I'm all
Yeah.
for people coming out and for showing that, like, not only is everybody exactly what we think they are at face value, I love hearing that somebody has an identity that they are more marginalized. You know, even if we might be like, oh, well, you're white, so I'm going to make this assumption about you. But being like, no, I have this other thing, another way in which I feel like I'm other, or in which I feel like society is kind of leaving me behind, or is,
That makes
putting me at
sense.
a disadvantage. But there's other times to do that. Like, have you heard about Shout Your Status?
I've seen it. I've not looked into it or investigated it at all.
I don't actually know how big it is, but Ella Dawson, who I mentioned last time we did our interview, um, she is a writer, a blogger who was kind of one of the first people to be like, hey, I have herpes, and she got internet famous for it. Um, I think you said you might have seen her TED Talk, and she has a really good website, especially for people who have first been diagnosed. If you go to, it's probably elladawson.com,
EllaDawson.com.
DAWSON, and she's got a whole section about herpes. She was the one who started this hashtag, and I think it was an association with a month that was like for STI status.
Mm-hmm.
And her idea was shout your status, let's make it a hashtag, let's make it public, and show that we're not ashamed to be positive for an STI.
Oh, okay.
So I think there is a whole month for that, and I don't know if there's another time for people of other identities, but I do think being sensitive to that and maybe making a post or telling your friends, like, hey, I see you and I support you, without feeling like
Like you have to be
you need to
included.
step in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And that makes sense. I'm glad you said that because that's a way, that's just not a way that I've thought about it as far as being able to support without having to be involved. So,
I see it both ways, though. I do know what you mean, because especially if you're part of some group and you want to be like, hey, me too, like, I'm here, I'm showing empathy with you,
mm-hmm.
I can understand that, but I've definitely seen some pushback, specifically only around the National Coming Out Day thing.
Yeah. And I've seen that. A good example would be like the Me Too campaign of like worst case scenario with the guys saying certain types of things that they really shouldn't be saying as far as like how
Yeah.
the women are sexually harassed and guys are like, well, we are too. No, that's not how this works.
See, that's
That's
interesting, because now you and I kind of have switched perspectives, because I didn't have a problem with my guy friends who've been sexually assaulted coming out as part of the Me Too campaign. I saw a lot of pushback from that, and I do understand where people are coming from when people are like, hey, dude, like, find another time to talk about this. Right now, this is women's moment. But I kind of feel like there's never a great time. Men are never given a good time to talk about when they've been sexually assaulted. Like, our society likes to pretend that that doesn't happen. And I've heard a lot of times that men are silenced about their sexual assault because people are like, well, we kind of don't need to listen to you women are the bigger deal here. And while it definitely, women being sexually assaulted is far more common and a far more bigger issue just because of how widespread it is, I also I also think men need to have that space too. We need to show that like sexual assault, patriarchy hurt everyone, including men. And I mostly, even if it isn't the right time for men to talk about that, I mostly didn't like the way I saw women approaching that, because a lot of my guy friends who were coming out at that time were being really vulnerable and talking about these experiences they've been totally traumatized by, and it would turn into these massive internet fights because women would jump on them and be like, "This is not your time. This is not your space." I was kind of like, you could message someone about that and bring it to their attention, but you starting a fight about it on the internet is not only taking up more space and drawing more attention to the men away from the women, but it's also just shitty to like take a survivor and attack them and like compound on that trauma that they're experiencing.
Well, I guess that the ones that I've seen or heard about in particular have been kind of passive aggressive. Like, oh yeah, well, like I don't want to say openly seen, but you would say like for guys who would be like, well, I'm just not going to talk to women anymore because I don't know when I'm sexually harassing them. I didn't mean like the extremes of people who have actually been sexually abused,
Okay,
but
I see what you mean. And now
I'm
I know what
glad
you're
you
talking
touched
about,
on
and I
that.
agree totally. Like,
Yeah.
fuck that.
Yeah.
That whole passive aggressive thing of like, oh, well, men get raped too. And they're just saying it as a talking point to detract attention. The people who I'm thinking of, luckily, I don't think I have a lot of friends like that.
Yeah.
I think the people that you're talking about, thank God they're not in my social circles as much. The men who I saw were really, really careful about it, had put a lot of thought and intention into it. They read the language very specifically when that Me Too thing first started going around. The text was like, if you have been sexually assaulted, it didn't, or like, this is for anyone who's been sexually assaulted. When it first came out, it wasn't saying women who've been sexually assaulted. So they read that language, they thought about it, they listened, they provided support for the women in their lives. But there are men who survived childhood sexual abuse, or a lot of times it's childhood, but there's, all kinds of situations in which people can be assaulted and
Yeah.
harassed.
Right.
And it's terrible for everyone. It's more systemic for women, which is why it needs more attention. But we also have to talk about the ways in which everybody's affected by it.
And now you sip your tea. I like how you did that. That was clutch time. You make this super valid point, and then you just grab your coffee mug or tea, and just take a sip. I love it.
I'm trying not to go all hoarse during
No,
the
it's fine.
conversation.
You take a drink whenever you need to. You're doing great, and I appreciate all of the insight you're doing. One of the things that I know I wanted to thank you for was, like I said before on the other episode that no one will ever hear because I'm coughing and all that kind of stuff, was just like thank you for coming out and sharing your post and saying, hey, I'm queer, bisexual, I have herpes, and then like sharing that you did that because like I told you before, that kind of had me like, oh, I was on the fence about sharing the podcast with the people on my Facebook feed and in my friend circle. So seeing that and then talking to you, I was like, oh, well, it's really not that big of a deal. Why not? So I didn't specifically come out and say I have herpes, but it was just, hey, I'm doing this podcast where I interview people who are living with STDs about their experience. And then if you listen to the podcast, obviously it's there, but more so recently because, well, now there's an article out from STL Today. Well, I'm from St. Louis, so that's our newspaper here. I had an interview with a junior reporter. She called me and just asked questions about the podcast, asked if she could write a story about it, and I think 2 months later, it got published. So there was an article out, and one of my clients actually sent it to me early on and was like, "Oh my God, I'm so proud of you, great job." I was like, "Oh, so this is out now." And I wasn't going to share it with anybody, but like the people closest to me who saw it were very, very supportive about it. And the opening line is Courtney, something, diagnosed with herpes 5 years ago. It's like, oh, well, shit,
Oh,
anyone who
there
opens
you
this
go.
knows.
St. Louis Today just came out for you.
Yeah, right? So,
That's amazing, though. I'm proud of you, too. And I think it's awesome that I understand that wanting to be humble and not wanting to be like, hey, look, there's a newspaper article
I
written about me.
know.
But at the same time, your audience is growing so fast. And part of that is things like that article and sharing it with your friends and letting people know, like, not only that your podcast is out there, but more and more people are going to realize they're not alone. And I think that's great.
And I've really struggled personally with, I realized today in just talking to family, well, and by family I mean like people in the people who I've started this podcast out with, just being supportive, and the groups that I've been in and gone to events with, like they were really supportive and just kind of gave me the courage to, well, not courage, but more so made me realize that how selfish it is to keep this to myself, because if I didn't share it on my own Facebook feed, then all of the people who know me wouldn't know that this was something that I was doing. And then when I did it, I got a lot of messages from people who were like, "Oh my God, I know someone," or "Thank you, I have blank." And I was just like, "Oh, so there's really not, there hasn't been any negative feedback at all as a result of doing this." And I mean, if there is, I haven't heard it yet, but that just kind of goes to show how awesome my own circle of friends are.
Yeah, I hear that. And I feel kind of the same way. Like, I actually, you and I talked about this in the last episode, or the last episode that will never be released from the
It is
vaults.
lost. That is a
Well,
lost
guys, that never
episode.
happened, basically. But we did talk about it. You asked about the feedback from when I did post to all my friends on Facebook about it. And I didn't really get that many private messages about it. I got a lot of support in that national, like in the their secret herpes
Yeah.
Facebook groups. People were really positive about it. But I will say that the more open I am about who I am as a person, like, and that includes my herpes status, the more people do reach out to me. Like, I do find a lot more people who, like, ask for my advice or come to me with something really personal, even if I don't know them that well, because they just see that you're a person who's going to be open and non-judgmental. And that's amazing. I love connecting with people in that way.
Yeah. So you didn't, I mean, I tell people from the first time that I did it, when I just shared the podcast, it was like, oh, a lot of people don't really care. So it's not an issue. So I would just continue to go on and do it, still have the interviews, post about it, blog about it, put it where it needed to be. And I've gotten way more like thank yous, and I needed this, and I didn't, like, I felt so alone, but to know that there's at least 12, 13, 14, however many people I've interviewed, people out there who have similar experiences, but like different stories, of course, just really help them get through their own personal diagnosis and what it is that they're dealing with. And then, like I said, in opening up about it, there have been people close to me who have shared their own experiences as well, and their own diagnosis, or being in relationships with someone who has an STD. So I think that the broad perspective really can and will help other people, um, as far as dealing with other people who have STDs, or if they have it themselves. So, like, the more of this, I want this to kind of focus on this episode in particular, to focus on being able to open up and share your diagnosis with someone, or if you're on the outside looking in, being open to accepting someone who has been diagnosed and chose to open up to you. So, my question to you, Luna, is, have you, as inside out, like it's hard to really make that call, but do you have any advice for someone who is negative, or who has tested negative, or doesn't have an STD, who has someone approach them who does have an STD and just kind of come out to them? Like, what kind of advice can you give someone who has been trusted enough to have someone open up to them with that information about something so secretive and important to them in their life?
That's kind of a big question because it depends on what context. Like, if it's a friend or a family member, somebody basically who you're not going to be sexually involved with, I think just coming at it with an open mind, like anything, it's a health condition. So I have an autoimmune disease. So if I went to a friend and was like, "Hey, I have this health thing that's going on, this autoimmune condition," and just really want to be open about it, because that's something I'm allowed. Like, I generally talk about just being there, like you'd be for a friend for anything, anything personal they came to you with, being understanding, not jumping to conclusions. Also, maybe doing some research if it is something that the negative person is concerned about, like knowing that you don't need to be afraid to like share clothes with your friend or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think people have a lot of misconceptions about like, I've seen some really weird stuff on the internet. I'm sure you have too.
Oh
It's
yeah.
like, oh, is it safe to like swim in the same pool as a person who has herpes or whatever bullshit thing people come up with. Um, yeah, that's you can totally safely swim in a pool with a person who has herpes. Not
I
kidding.
was gonna make sure to
So
say that if you didn't, like, hey, you can swim in a pool with people who have herpes.
right, and I can't actually think of a better example because I'm like, I don't know what things are people. I guess people are concerned about sharing cups. You probably could get herpes from sharing a cup with someone who has it. I'm not really sure.
So the latest science has shown from groups that I'm in where there's articles being shared that the closest thing would be like lipstick. It can't survive on like herpes is passed on skin to skin. And
Mm-hmm.
the closest shareable object that you can contract herpes from is like a thing of chapstick. If I have herpes, I'm having an outbreak, I put chapstick on and I immediately pass it over to someone else to put the chapstick on. That is a likely way to pass it on.
Mm-hmm. That's funny you brought that up because I was just talking about that like last week with a couple friends of mine. Um, I had read somewhere that herpes doesn't survive, like you were saying, when it's not on skin. If it was on, let's say, like a sex toy or something like that, if it was exposed to air, I think for 10 seconds, could be wrong about that number. I think it dies. But we were talking about how chapstick and lipstick, if you put it on, then you put the cap on, then it's keeping moisture in there, and maybe that allows the virus to survive.
I didn't read that, but I can see how that could be. That's something I'll have to come back on and confirm for us because I'm not 100% sure about that. But
I'm kind of guessing too. It was just kind of a theory that I was like, huh, I thought I read that herpes doesn't survive
mhm,
outside of the skin for more than 10 seconds, but maybe in like an area that had some moisture in it, it could.
yeah,
So I think the chapstick thing is totally right. Anyway, my point was get some information, know that your friend doesn't need to be, a
yeah,
pariah. Like you can still be friends with them, you can still associate with them just because they have herpes. And
right,
be understanding, you know?
mhm,
And then if it's a person who you are interested in having sex with, or having a relationship with even, let alone sex, keep an open mind there too. Like, even if you don't want to contract herpes, think about all the different ways that you can have a close relationship with that person with putting yourself at very low risk. I mean, first of all, you can have a close relationship with somebody and not have intercourse. You could have a close relationship with
right.
somebody and like they could be on daily antivirals, or you could have sex in other ways. Like you could just do things with hands and toys using gloves. People need to open their mind about the way they have sex in relationships too, especially if they are dating someone with a positive status and they want to keep their status negative.
You can do so much
And I
with
think
like
it's
chains and handcuffs and rope and stuff too. So I mean, that's all
totally, yeah.
just throwing that out on the table. But
There's all kinds of stuff you can do if you just like
use your
open your mind about
imagination.
that. And again, even if you're bringing that to the conversation, not saying like, oh, well, you're dirty and therefore I can't have sex with you, but being like, hey, I really care about you. I want to be intimate with you in some way, but I'm concerned about, especially if people have legitimate reason. Like if someone does have whatever, if they have another condition that makes getting herpes a higher risk for them,
hmm
mention that. Be like, I'm just concerned about it for this reason. It's not that I think that you're any less sexy or any less desirable.
That's a really good point too, because obviously rejection is something that a lot of people deal with who have herpes or any other condition, and we take it as there being a problem with us for having something like, oh, I have herpes, nobody's gonna want to have sex with me. First off, it's wrong of us. I don't want to say it's wrong, but the generation that we live in, with it being 2017 and sex being so available to us, it's like we're rejected for having a condition rather than being seen as a suitable life partner or whatever it is that we're looking for. Like, we don't take it as the person who is rejecting us is more so looking out for their own personal health. We take it as we're not good enough. And that's really not the case, because if the shoe were on the other foot and you're someone who is uninformed or has been misinformed about herpes, and you don't have any like education or background about it, someone tells you they have herpes and you're looking to have sex with them, you're more than likely going to be like, nah, no thanks, rather than taking the time to do your research and everything. And then too, it's all about the approach. So if you're going to disclose to someone close to you, You wouldn't disclose to a family member the same way you would someone you just want to hook up with. You wouldn't disclose to someone you just want to hook up with the same way you would someone you really love and care about. And
Hmm.
the reason that I want to talk about this is because as soon as we get done here, I'm going to upload this and send it to a friend of mine, someone I recently met. He plans on disclosing to his partner this weekend. Actually, he said he was going to do it this weekend, and he and I were going to talk. But I think that this may be something that's more useful and helpful to him, in terms of giving him the courage to disclose to her. Because I mean, we don't even think about the best case scenario where if we disclose to someone and they're just like, oh yeah, me too.
Yeah, I
Which
love that scenario.
happens. Yeah.
You and I've talked about that too, like how good that feels when you're so scared and you're so vulnerable and you're like, I'm about to tell you this thing that for so many people is a deal breaker, but you tell them they're like, oh yeah, same. It's awesome.
Yeah, and then the date's
Um,
over. We eat our food and we just leave and go get the ropes, handcuffs, and whips and chains.
yeah, totally. I was also gonna say I finally finished after like a year of working on this. I finally finished this resource slash zine I made that's about having better STI conversations. So I can send that to you.
Yeah.
I'm gonna put it online at some point. One of my partners is actually working on illustrating it. He's coming up with these really cool cartoons and stuff like
Oh,
that
nice.
that are gonna make it more fun. But you can send that to your friend as well, just the text, and
Okay.
it's basically like some of the things I just said phrased a lot better because I've like been editing it for a year. Um, but I talk both about if you have an STI, how to disclose, and how to make it, at your comfort level. Like, I have no issue with people disclosing or asking about STIs if they're a person who's negative, um, via phone, via text message, like, however you're comfortable. It doesn't have to be a heavy face to face conversation.
Yeah.
I tend to do things, speaks to my age a little bit too, um, but I used to think it was a really negative thing to have STI conversation or like any heavy conversation in general via text because I was like, no, you were supposed to have serious relationship conversations face to face.
Right.
And a friend of mine who I used to date pointed out to me that that's kind of ageist. Like, we do so much communication now with messaging and with phone and whatever, like Snapchat even. And so for us to like, that's a natural way for us to communicate. We don't have to sit down face to face and have this conversation, especially if it's something that people are nervous about. And if they were sitting in front of a person, they might not be as organized in their thoughts or they might forget specific questions they wanted to ask. Like, if you can do it via text, you could like text them a photo of your test results, or you could be
Right.
like, hey, I'm going to do this really careful, thought out thing that doesn't have any judgment, And especially if we are really steeped in this culture that has so much stigma,
Hmm.
that can sometimes come out in our conversation, even when we don't mean it to. Like, you might be nervous and you might be like, oh, are you clean? Even then you're like, I know that language is wrong. Like, I don't want to use
It
that
is.
language. But things can
Clear
slip
is a
out.
much better word. Are you cleared or clear?
I like
Someone.
negative too. And
Yeah.
especially like, what specific things are you negative for? Because there's a lot of STIs we can't test for.
Hmm.
So being like everything, saying I'm negative for everything is not accurate, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. That makes sense. All right. So, oh, I meant to ask you this. I'm trying to go over in my head what we covered in the last episode, which was a lot and was a lot longer than this one's gonna be. But one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is like you're polyamorous. So as far as disclosing to your partners, how has that gone? Or do you only date people who also have herpes?
I definitely do not choose partners based on STI status. I
Okay.
know people who do. I have some stories about that, or at least one story I can think of about that, where a person who I went on a few dates with only dated people who also had HSV too. And that was because of the way they had outbreaks. Their outbreaks were terrible, and they never wanted to inflict that upon someone
Yeah,
else.
but the thing is, it varies from person to person. So,
It
like,
does,
you can
yeah.
have severe, terrible, absolute horrible outbreaks just as a result of maybe not having the best immune system, or that's just how herpes affects you. But then go on and be with someone who, well, I'm talking about this from like backwards angles. So, let's say I'm someone who doesn't get outbreaks. I got my first outbreak, and then time passes and if I feel like I'm gonna have an outbreak, which is just like a little tingling sensation that doesn't go away immediately, then I'm popping Valtrex and that's it. And I've only had to
Mm-hmm.
do that maybe a handful of times, but I could have gone on to be with someone who, is later having the most severe outbreaks on a regular basis, who antivirals aren't working for, and then like that that kind of case, it just goes to show how much it varies on the spectrum of severity. You can have nothing, or you can have the absolute worst of the worst case scenarios.
Yeah, totally. And I also think that my HSV2 outbreaks aren't bad, and I think it's because I have the antibodies to HSV1 already, and I've had them my whole life. So I think that's made my outbreaks less severe, and I do think that's probably influenced the way, how seriously I feel about it too. Like, that person didn't want to date anyone who didn't have HSV2 because, like, their outbreaks were so bad, they were ruining their life for a period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I'm a little bit too nonchalant about that experience because I don't share it. Like, my outbreaks have really been no big deal.
Right.
Like, they're irritating. It's like nobody really wants to have bumps on their genitals. Like, it's not pleasant,
Yeah.
but it's not like it's not interrupting my day or anything like that.
Got it.
So anyway, my point with that was that I interact with people who feel that way. I don't personally feel that way.
Yeah.
I think it's awesome when someone does match my STI status because it's just one less thing we have to worry about,
One
and
less
like
worry. Yeah.
it's less stressful, and we can also just relate on that level. An ex of mine who's also a really close friend of mine already knew that I had herpes when we went on our first date, and towards the end of our date we were like walking back to the car or whatever, and she was like, by the way, I also have herpes. And it was like, I got excited in the moment. I got kind of embarrassed because I'm like, I'm not excited that you have herpes. I'm just like excited that our status matches. And she was like, no, I know. But she had just been diagnosed and it was like a really heavy thing for her.
Mm-hmm.
And I think now her perspective has changed so much. Like, we've been able to grow a lot together
Right.
in our relation to having that STI. Like, we can talk about it really openly. We can like, because we're not monogamous, if we've been dating other people, we can talk about other people's reactions to us coming out to them
Right.
or disclosing to them, and like having that support is amazing. So anyway, it's a nice bonus when someone has it, but I don't pick people based on that.
Yeah.
And I disclose. My favorite way to disclose is let everybody in the whole world know that I have herpes, so I don't have to disclose that much.
Yeah. I talked about
It
this
makes it
before, but
easier.
I was listening to this. There's this Childish Gambino song where he's on a bus going home from camp, and he likes his girl, and he told her, and he told her something, and then later on, another girl came up to him and said that same thing in like a joking manner, and he was like, "Yeah, I learned this thing." And it's just basically to put whatever it is out there for the world. If you put it out there, then it's not a secret, and nobody can like later try and hurt you with it or use it against you. So that's like a super cool, powerful way to look at it as well.
Yeah, for me it has been, but I do want to like point out, and especially for other STIs, I think people have a lot of stigma against herpes, but like there's also a lot of stigma against HIV/AIDS, you know,
Yes, there
and
is.
so there are times when people could disclose and someone could react violently, you know. People do disclose and there can be really negative repercussions, like someone could kill someone else because they'd be like, what the fuck, you tricked me, I can't believe you have HIV. Like, it could,
Mm.
there could be a violent outcome, so I don't want to downplay that either.
Have you
Like,
heard
I
of
think
any situations
I'm
like
gonna
that before?
have what.
Have you heard of situations happening like that before?
The reason I bring that up is specifically because of debate I saw online recently where that was mentioned, and I
Mm.
don't have cases that I can refer to. I would have to do more research to
Okay.
see, but I wouldn't be surprised if that happened.
Because I
Like,
mean, yeah, like
there
violent
is a lot of
reactions,
stigma.
it's not very common. I mean, I guess maybe we just wouldn't hear about those as much, but I mean, I can see someone finding out later, like, what the fuck, you gave me HIV or whatever it may be. I can see that, but I just wanted to know if you knew of any like actual examples or if there were any news
I
articles.
don't, and so I'm a
Okay,
little bit like only referring to that because of a specific conversation that I had recently, and that
got
was
it.
brought up as a point
Hmm.
that it can be dangerous for some people to disclose.
Yeah,
So I do want to mention that and say that like I'm privileged to be able to disclose, and I don't feel like anything really bad is going to happen from it. You
yeah.
know,
What's a
even Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna just ask you, like, what's a good time to disclose? What's the best time you find to disclose? Is it immediately? Is it after the first date? Is it just kind of go with the flow and see how the conversation's going, or when?
I go with the flow. So for a lot of people, like I said, I just kind of let everybody know I have herpes. So also part of the reason I was going to speak to, part of the reason why I don't, I'm not picky about people's STI status when I choose to date them is like my dating pool's already small. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
people need to be non-monogamous. Like that needs to be consensual and agreed upon. That like we're not going to become a monogamous relationship at any point because it's highly unlikely that I will.
Right.
And they need to be feminist. They need to be like have certain political things we agree upon. There's just like a checklist,
It's like
of
a
all the things
people
you look for in
thing.
a partner, and
Yeah.
then to add on one more thing, that's just that's just too difficult. So I don't, but then I tend to just like let my whole community know. So in terms of the polyamorous groups I'm in, Facebook groups and communities and things like that, I just drop it in conversation all the time. Like I just let it be known so that
Hmm.
most people in my dating pool kind of already know about that. Um, but if not, I always like to check in too, and definitely before I have sex with someone, I have a specific conversation and I disclose. So it may come up before I'm considering having sex with someone, or it might be when I'm talking about hooking up with someone, or I feel like it's going that direction.
Yeah.
And I probably drop it in. I'm kind of like, oh, hey, so by the way, on this next date, like, I would, really love to play with you after the date and see where things go. But I just want to let you know beforehand, like, I have HSV 1 and 2. I tested in November negative for chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis, and HIV, or like whatever I've been tested for. Um, and then I'll ask when they were last tested. And so I have a very clear conversation around that. And I think a lot of people might think that that's awkward. Like I do
And
try
it
to mention
shouldn't
it
be. It
before.
shouldn't be awkward. And that's
I don't
what's
think it's awkward, but I think
no.
that in like mainstream monogamous heteronormative culture, a lot of people do think it's awkward. They think it's supposed to be like in the movies where you just kiss someone and you never ask what you're gonna do. You just like slip into bed and have this like
Yeah,
somehow
like
amazing sex without communicating at all.
in Wonder Woman. Obviously, Wonder Woman hadn't had sex before, but Steve, whatever his name was, he had sex before, clearly, and you know they didn't have any condoms on set. Like,
Well, they didn't actually show them having
no,
sex,
no, they didn't
right?
show them having sex, but like if you just take that and like look at how society's being programmed, it's like, all right, you kiss, you lay down in the bed, and yeah, the camera goes away. But when you
Exactly.
become
No, but I even think
older,
that's an issue.
yeah,
I
it
think that's an issue
is.
how the camera just goes away. So we never hear, like, if you're even, there's all kinds of issues that you want to talk about before. Like, if Wonder Woman had never had sex in that movie, like, shouldn't that be something you want to talk about? Like, I would probably want to talk about that and let that be known and be like, hey, let me know if this is uncomfortable. Like, I want you to know that from Steve's perspective, like, he
Yeah.
should have been like, if anything is hurting or if you want to stop at any point, like please let me know that. Like show us having a conversation about consent or about like anything, just
Mhm.
anything. But media totally erases that and pulls the camera away because we can't ever see that.
And at that point, it's on us to take what we know, and a lot of what we know just comes from porn. So it's like, all right, at that point, if I'm a teenager, this is my perception of sex. Oh, you kissed a girl, the next thing you do, you lay on the bed, then fill in the blank. You fill in the blank with shit that happens in porn, and you like that's not what sex is. So
Right.
like we're kind of on our own to fill in the blanks, growing up. So I don't know what we can do educational, like as sex educators, like as kids you don't really want to look to your parents for sex. We often look to our friends who also find porn and come across that kind of stuff. So the education tools really just aren't there to know, all right, you should probably have a conversation about STDs, you should probably talk about condoms, you should probably bring up consent, of course. I mean, obviously in the movie consent wasn't an issue because you see these kinds of movies all the time. The guy gets the girl or the girl gets the guy, and bam, at some point they hook up, and like that's the end of it. There's no post conversation or anything, and
Right.
we're just filling in the blanks with whatever it is that we've learned or what we've taught ourselves.
I know. I really wish there was more. I mean, I definitely have thoughts about sex education for teenagers and kids too, but especially in media, I wish there was some examples of like even about good consent conversations. 'Cause consent doesn't need to be like do you want me to have sex with you right now? Like, it doesn't need
Yeah.
to be all, weird like that. Like, you can, first of all, you can make it really sexy. Like, there's plenty of ways you can kind of make dirty talk about consent. Be like, I
Please
would love
give
to
me an
like kiss your neck
example.
right now or whatever. Like, you can drop that into your interaction, or you can do it like me and have what maybe would be an awkward conversation, but I do it via text and like lay things out. And I'm straight up like,
I
hey,
mean,
I
that's
want to
kind of
bang you.
foreplay, though.
Let's talk
Yeah,
about
like,
STIs.
yeah, like that's foreplay. Hey, I want to grab your neck, throw you up against the wall, and do all these things. If that's okay, and if we can have these conversations about our
Yeah,
STI status, blah blah blah, and then at that
exactly.
point, it's
And you can
like,
make
oh
that
yeah, let's have that
so that
conversation.
even via text too, be like, I would love to throw you up against a wall. Be like, do you want that?
Yeah,
Or even make someone ask for it. Be like, hey, I want to do these things. Do you want it? And they could be like, yes. Be like, no, do you really want it?
yeah,
Draw
like
it
make them
out. Get that
beg.
double consent. Like, you can make it really fun.
Yeah,
So
and then if
anyway,
you
that
got
would be
text
awesome to
messages,
see in
yeah,
media.
hmm
And there was something I was watching the other day. Oh, have you watched She's Gotta Have It yet?
nope.
Okay, so it's Spike Lee made this movie in the 80s, and then he like redid it as a TV show.
Oh,
It's on
I've
Netflix,
heard of it. Yeah.
and it's cool because it's like the main character is a black woman. She's polyamorous and pansexual, so that's awesome for my communities because that's representation. But I definitely had some issues with the show. Like, there was things I really liked about it, but I really didn't like the way they were portraying sex because it was kind of porny, where it was just like that like pounding acrobatic
Oh
weird
yeah.
sex. And I was like, does anyone really have sex standing up for like that long
I
in the middle of the
mean,
room? Okay, you're a personal trainer, so maybe you do.
no comment.
I can't do that.
uh,
And also, I just like, is it comfortable for me? But I didn't like that they never showed any of those conversations. Like,
mm,
is she supposed to be this super? She is like in the show a very socially justice aware, super cool like millennial woman, but she never has any of those conversations exactly. Like, she does mention at some point that she always uses condoms, but there's never any mention of
so that's it
testing.
then. Like that's it. It's at that point I'm being programmed to know. Oh, just use a condom. And then
Mm-hmm.
even then, like that kind of goes out of the window sometimes when you're drunk or when you do have the conversation like, "Hey, are you on birth control?" Because while "Hey, are you on birth control" means, "Oh, I'm more protected from pregnancy," to someone else that means, "Oh, I don't have to use this condom."
Mm-hmm. And it doesn't actually protect against, as we know, HSV or HPV.
Yeah.
Like, I mostly use Well, I don't know. I definitely had a phase in my life where I did not use condoms very much. But you can still get or give herpes when you have a condom on. So like that still needs to be a thing that's discussed.
hmm
Anyway, I
And
feel like
it's
I've
just
gotten really off topic here.
no,
You asked me a
you're on
question a while
topic.
back that I totally
You're on
forgot.
topic. Because consent is something, and this is something I can now. I have a lot of conversations with people now about different things sex wise. It's not just STDs. I mean, obviously, sex is related to the show, but like people who, I forget the lady's name, but she reached out to me. She wants to do a project about consent, and she really wants to put something together along those lines. And she just reached out just to kind of plant the seed. We don't know exactly what's going to happen with it, but we just bounced ideas off one another, and she wants to do something to bring more awareness to consent and being able to have these kinds of conversations. So this is going to be helpful to her too. So you keep talking, like we've got stuff here.
That actually reminded me when you brought it back to that. The other thing we were going to talk about was sex ed. Like, you were saying something about what type of sex ed we need for kids. Like, I had no sex ed,
No,
essentially. Like, I had a little bit, but it was kind of like they split us up by gender, and they were pretty much like, oh, you're going to get your period at some point. And then a couple years later, we had this like really open-ended sex ed class where our teacher, we were in 8th grade, and our teacher was like, ask me anything you want about sex. And we were
you don't know what
14, so
to
of course we asked the
ask.
dumbest questions. We were like, what positions have you tried? Like, just
And then
stupid shit.
laughing behind it. Yeah.
And I think we need, curriculums
So it's a matter
that,
of
like,
educating the educators.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely, definitely. And on a number of different things, like for them to be sensitive to all kinds of different minorities, about the actual statistics around STIs.
hmm
We need to totally get rid of abstinence only education, because like abstinence only to me isn't even education at all.
No,
It's
it's
just
it's
like dogmatic,
looking
and
away.
yeah, and pretending that this thing doesn't exist and that kids won't have sex if you don't talk about it, which
Yeah.
is like the opposite of true.
Yeah. And there's just all these unspoken rules, and like if kids ask where babies come from, they don't come from the fucking stork. I don't know at what point it's appropriate to have that conversation about, sex with children, because other people's children, it's a matter of being aware of other parents. Not all parents are gonna
Yeah.
be on
Oh
the
god, that's
same
such a good point.
page about
That's
it,
such a good
but
point because like you can be as open with your kid as you want from the day
yeah,
they're born. You can be like, yeah, here's how baby is made, and keep it really like kids are not going to be turned on by that. It's not sexy to be like the egg. The sperm fertilizes the egg, and then the egg starts growing in the over or like in
yeah.
the uterus. That's not. No one's going to be like, oh, I can't wait to do that.
Hmm.
Because you're
And
not actually talking about, first of all, when most parents talk about sex, they're not talking about any of the pleasurable parts of it.
no,
They're just talking about procreation. And I think at some point in time, you should have very pleasure focused sex education. Like, people should not be in the dark about that. But you have to be aware of what other parents are going to tell their kids. And if your kid is going to go be honest and,
hmm,
like, get in trouble at school because their parents were real with them,
hmm,
I don't know.
yeah. And
I'm not a parent, so I don't think
another
about that
good
stuff. But
point behind that is like I was talking to my girlfriend the other day, and her nephew knows what a vagina is, and he's 7. And one thing that came up was like it's important for kids young that age to know what their private parts are, because if they are sexually assaulted or molested or anything like that, they're able to communicate more effectively. They're not saying so and so took my cookie or touched my cookie, because at that point, we don't really know if they're talking about cookies or if they're talking about their private parts. So being able to identify what having that open conversation and giving them that understanding of, all right, this is legitimately a penis, this is legitimately a vagina, we're not using
or
code
a
words
vulva.
here.
Really
Yeah.
quick, I want to point out too that
Oh,
like even that language around vulvas and vaginas, so much, especially in like actually in all media, it doesn't really matter what gender it's focused on. People use vagina to refer to the entire vulva and vagina, like all of that area, and that's not accurate either because a lot of women or people with vulvas will go to the doctor, to the gynecologist, and be like, oh well, I had this spot in my vagina, and that's not accurate for your doctor to know either. Like if you had something that was on your labia, that's not the same as in your vagina, and that could be a totally different problem, a totally different condition, or your doctor needs to know where to look. So we need to be specific around that language too. Like, for people with penises, we wouldn't just be like talking about your testes or your balls
no.
when you're talking about your penis. Like, they're two different things.
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, because I mean I'm guilty of it. I say vagina, 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 and I mean everything right there, like the
Well, that's why I like the
inside
word
to
cunt,
outside.
but a lot of people don't like that.
Yeah. So we're at a pretty good point to wrap up. Is there
Okay.
anything else that you wanted to touch on or leave us with? And I mean, we can talk for hours. We already talked about this, so
Mm-hmm.
we're already at a little over 50 minutes, and we can definitely come back and talk again. Like I enjoy talking to you.
I do too. Um, I don't have anything specific to say really. I do want to say look out for. I've got projects coming up that I'm definitely going to share with you, and I would love to share. I will also share with the internet, but I feel like you've got a good platform now
Whoop
for
whoop.
me to mention this. A friend of mine just reached out the other day and is trying to start a project of like multidisciplinary. I talked to you about this.
Yeah.
She's a doctor and is trying to pull together all kinds of medical professionals and sex educators for us to come up with a really good resource that's complete about STIs, all the most up to date information we have about what they are, what are the transmission rates, what type of activities put you at risk. So, if anyone knows of that existing already, I would like to hear about it, because we just don't know if there's like a single central resource where you can find all of that
Oh,
stuff.
we'll
As
find
it
it.
stands right now, you're like digging through Facebook groups, looking at documents that are 10 years old.
Shots fired.
Yeah. And also, I'm gonna publish that zine once it finishes
Okay.
getting illustrated.
Yeah,
That's
let
about
me
how to
know, and
have better
I'll
STI
I'll
conversations,
be sure to
and
share
it's
that
got
as well.
what was that?
I'll be sure to share that as well.
That'd be great. Yeah, I'm gonna put it on my website, and it has like little conversation snippets for if you feel uncomfortable at something, kind of example starter places that you could use to bring up these conversations.
Yeah,
So
sounds
those are
good.
things I've got coming up.
Awesome. How can people find you, Luna?
You can go to herbslut.com, herbslut.com. I'm on Instagram as herbslut and Twitter as herb_slut.
Awesome. You can go ahead and say bye to the people.
Bye. Thank you, Courtney. It's always good talking to you.
No problem. And with that being said, this concludes this episode of Something Positive for Positive People. I just did slash am doing a recap of 2017, looking at a lot of the feedback that I got, what we're doing well, what we could change up. And one of the things that I'm looking to do is probably start editing these episodes. Luckily, I haven't had to yet. I just like cut off the ends and then merge them together, which is really easy. But little things like background noise and all that kind of stuff, trying to get rid of that for 2018. But I'm not gonna touch on all of that here. I'll do a separate episode just to recap what's happened in 2017 and what you guys can expect for 2018. I can be found on Instagram and Twitter at H on my chest. I'm also on Tumblr, which I don't use. I just kind of post everything from Instagram to Twitter and Tumblr, and then like that's all that's there. But if you want to get in contact with me, if you want to be on the show or you have someone you want on the show, let me know. I'll reach out to them and see if they can get on here. I found a lot of guests through guests, so I take all of you guys' feedback into consideration. I appreciate you taking the time to listen. Please, please, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and now podchaser.com. That's a new one, but it's something that everyone can listen to through any web browser. So far, so good. I really like it. I played around on the website, and it's very user friendly, very interactive, and easy to rate and review for sure. Um, if you, I guess that's it. Like, I'm not gonna keep doing all of this, but like I said, I can be found on Instagram. That's where I'm at most of the time, at H on my chest. And if you like this episode, like I said, please rate and review it. Don't be scared. Like, I know a lot of people won't follow the Instagram account or the Twitter page just because of the association there, but there are a lot of people who follow me who don't have STDs or STIs, so you don't have anything to be scared of. But for those who don't, you can still just continue to check in for more updates on new episodes and anything else we got going on. So, till next time, stay positive. I have to move very slowly to turn this off so that there's not like a pop noise.